Donald Trump is polling exceptionally well in the battleground states ahead of the 2024 election, especially when you take a look at states in the Sun Belt, places like Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. Donald Trump is polling outside of the margin of error, which means if the election were held today, he would likely carry these states against Joe Biden. So we're going to take a look at Donald Trump's polling lead state by state and talk about potentially why Donald Trump is polling so well, how he can continue this polling lead going into November, and ultimately what's likely to happen from here on out in the general election, because we're still months and months away from November, but we're at a point right now where Donald Trump seems to be gaining on Joe Biden, both in the statewide polls and nationally. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. Now, the polls are actually looking pretty good for Donald Trump right now and pretty bad for Joe Biden. So obviously you have the general election polls. Donald Trump is up by 1 point. That doesn't mean a whole lot because obviously general election polls don't determine the outcome of the winner, but typically Republicans aren't leading in the general election polls to begin with, so obviously that's a good sign for former President Trump. But if you factor in a 2 or 3 point polling swing in Joe Biden's direction, Donald Trump would lose the national popular vote, but only by around 2 points, which is about the margin he lost in 2016 when he ended up winning the election. So if that's any metric to go by, Donald Trump is in a good position right now to beat Joe Biden. And as for Joe Biden, I think his numbers are pretty abysmal right now. Not even just the polls in the various battleground states, but when you look at the demographic breakdown of national polls, groups like young voters, Hispanic voters, black voters, these are supposed to be core constituencies for Democrats. Joe Biden is viewed very, very unfavorably by these groups compared to other Democrats, and a big enthusiasm gap in turnout between black voters, Hispanic voters, and white working class voters could mean the difference between Joe Biden holding on and winning a second term or Donald Trump beating Joe Biden in 2024. So, these are the national polls as they are right now. Joe Biden's numbers are pretty terrible. In fact, if you take a look at the presidential approval, according to RCP, he's underwater by 16 points now, which just a couple of days ago, and I made a previous video, we talked about this, he was underwater by 14 points. So Joe Biden continues to take a nosedive in the national approval polls. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. I think the sluggish economy is the main one. You have chaos in the Middle East, which I think is another issue for him. Interestingly enough, though, an odd caveat in these polls is that Democrats are actually leading the generic congressional vote polls, which is pretty interesting because Republicans are winning the presidential polls, which is normally a vote that they're less likely to win, the national popular vote when it comes to the presidency, than the House popular vote, which is obviously a little bit different because you have to factor in districts that have only one person running in them, uncontested seats, and that certainly skews the actual congressional popular vote at the end of the day. But Democrats pulling ahead of Republicans in the congressional vote is interesting, and it's probably something we'll talk about in a later video because I think Democrats still probably have an edge when it comes to the House elections, albeit very narrowly. But looking at some of these polls, we'll start off maybe with Arizona. Donald Trump is up by 5.2%. Again, this is outside the typical margin of error of polls, which is anywhere from 3 points to 4.2 in this aggregate. And even despite that, Donald Trump is still up, meaning if the polls swing in a 4-point direction to Joe Biden, Donald Trump would still win Arizona by around a point or so. So this is really bad for Joe Biden because Arizona is a state where Democrats have continued to make gains and Republicans have really been losing their grip on the state overall, really ever since 2016 when Donald Trump won the state pretty narrowly compared to previous Republicans, and John McCain won by a landslide. Ever since then, statewide races in Arizona have been going more and more towards Democrats. Democrats have won every Senate race since 2016 and obviously carried Arizona in 2020. Now, Arizona was one of the closest states back in the 2020 election, so it's really not surprising that Donald Trump is polling pretty well here, considering the fact that Joe Biden is underwater by 16 points, and if there were any state where he would make up ground, it should be Arizona. Now, as I noted before, the trends in Arizona are against Republicans overall, especially when it comes to the Phoenix metro area. You've had an influx of Democratic voters. You've had suburban voters shifting away from the Republican Party towards Democrats. And you have an increasing Latino population, which, while it is sort of drifting towards the right over time, still majority votes Democrat. So when you put all those factors in together, Arizona is getting more Democrat as a whole, and 2024 could certainly be an outlier election since Joe Biden is so unpopular. But the fact that Arizona is this close to begin with just shows you how far Arizona has come from the Republican column into sort of this purple area, because, you know, if you go back to 2008 or 2012 even, Arizona was not remotely in contention, and yet Democrats were winning the popular vote by 6-7 points, nationally speaking. So Donald Trump being up 5 points in Arizona shouldn't be too surprising. You know, this is a state that has typically sometimes overestimated Republicans. We saw that back in the midterms, and we're probably going to talk about it a little later in this video, because that could certainly be a silver lining for Democrats, is just that the polls are undersampling likely Democratic voters or people in suburban areas that are more likely to vote Democratic than Republican, and sort of oversampling rural white working class voters, just assuming by default that their turnout is going to be significantly higher than we saw back in 2022. So obviously Arizona is looking good for Donald Trump. Georgia is looking pretty good for Donald Trump. Nearly a 5-point lead in the state of Georgia. This was the closest state back in the 2020 election. Donald Trump only lost Georgia by 0.2%. It was only a 12,000 vote majority for Joe Biden, and that was really because of the Atlanta metro area trending extremely far in the Democratic direction. In some cases, you've got counties going 16 points more Democratic than 2016, 12, 10, 14, and these are all counties that are densely populated. They're suburban and even urban counties. And while rural Georgia is dark red, you know, in the northern parts of the state and the southeastern parts of the state, they can't quite outvote Atlanta. And as a result, that's why you've seen Democrats win a couple of the past statewide races in Georgia, whether it be the special elections after 2020, which occurred in 2021, or of course the midterms. You know, Democrats have had much more luck in federal races in Georgia as opposed to statewide races, because while you've had people like Donald Trump lose the state on a presidential level, Brian Kemp won re-election in Georgia pretty comfortably in 2022, as did all of the other statewide Republicans, barring Herschel Walker. So, you know, Georgia hasn't been totally bleak for the Republicans, even though the Atlanta has pretty concerning trends away from the Republican Party. There still is some hope if Republicans can chip away at exurban areas enough and get turnout high in northern and southeastern Georgia. They could potentially, albeit very temporarily for maybe the next few years, offset the voting patterns in Atlanta. But so far, looking good for Trump in Georgia. And Georgia polls, interestingly enough, have been pretty spot on. If you take a look at the midterms last time around with Brian Kemp, the 2020 election was almost spot on, Joe Biden narrowly winning Georgia. 2021, the polls were pretty spot on. And, you know, the polls had David Perdue winning in 2020, which if Georgia didn't have its runoff system, David Perdue would still be in the Senate today. So this is a pretty bad sign for Joe Biden, because polls in Georgia have a pretty good track record, and as of right now, Donald Trump is winning by nearly 5 points. And if Georgia is being carried by Donald Trump by 5 points, Trump is winning North Carolina, he's probably going to win Arizona, and could potentially win Nevada as well. Now, if we move on to Nevada, this is probably the most surprising of all of these swing state polls, is the fact that Donald Trump is ahead by over 6 points. And this was a state that Hillary Clinton had won back in 2016 and Joe Biden had won in 2020 by the exact same margin. So Donald Trump has made significant inroads in Nevada, at least according to the polls, to the point where, you know, Trump being up by 6 points, it seems very hard to believe, if that polling average continues, that Joe Biden is somehow going to win the state. Again, if that holds. And obviously I think the polls are going to fluctuate as we get closer to the election. But as of right now, Donald Trump is in a very strong position to win the state of Nevada. And if Democrats are losing Nevada in 2024, that's extremely bad, because they're probably losing Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and potentially one of the Rust Belt states. And if that happens, Donald Trump beats Joe Biden. So Trump really only needs one of the Rust Belt states in order to win, provided he holds strong in the Sun Belt. And right now the polling is saying that Trump is probably going to hold pretty strong in the Sun Belt. Now, if we move on to the Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania is pretty interesting, because last time we looked at Pennsylvania, Joe Biden was actually leading in this state incredibly narrowly, and that was probably because we had some poll that I think had Joe Biden up pretty considerably, but the polls have sort of balanced out now, and you've had a lot of polls where Donald Trump has been leading, which basically puts Donald Trump at a 2-point margin of victory in Pennsylvania. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that Trump wins Pennsylvania in 2024. I think Republicans should be very cautious of polling leads in places like Pennsylvania. If we just go back to 2022, for example, John Fetterman beat Dr. Oz by around 5 points in Pennsylvania, and that was all while the polls in the state actually had Dr. Oz up very narrowly. So the polls had Dr. Oz by half a point, let's say, over John Fetterman, and Fetterman ends up winning the state by 5. So, obviously there's different dynamics there. You have the Mastriano factor, things like that. But I would caution a lot of enthusiastic Republicans about these polls, because we have seen examples very recently where polls and Republicans have been overestimated in places like Pennsylvania. If we move on to Wisconsin, for example, this is another really close state that could ultimately decide the election, and it was one of the closest states back in 2020. Trump is up by 0.6 in the state. That's the exact margin that Joe Biden had won here 4 years ago. And, polls are neck and neck here, which really shouldn't be that surprising. The Quinnipiac poll has Biden up by 6, but the rest of the polls have Donald Trump up very narrowly. So all in all, you get about a 1-point polling average for Donald Trump. Now, again, that doesn't mean a whole lot, because if the polls swing 2 or 3 points in Biden's direction, Biden wins Wisconsin, he wins Pennsylvania, and he wins Michigan, which means he wins the election. Because if we do the math here, all we have to do is really flip Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and Joe Biden gets to 270, all else being equal. Now, if Nebraska does finalize that whole consolidation of the electoral votes, and the Republicans are able to win there, let's say the entire state, because the 2nd district is sort of taken out of this special category, because it's really the only swingy congressional district in Nebraska. The rest of the state is very red. This would essentially put us in that nightmare scenario of 269 to 269. Of course, if Democrats play defense and, enact a similar law in Maine, making the state winner take all, that would put Democrats back at 270. So if Maine and Nebraska sort of go in this direction, all else being equal, Joe Biden would still win. So Donald Trump must win one of the Rust Belt states in order to win. Surprisingly enough, this is the map right now, and I know I messed with the Rust Belt states, but this is where the polling puts the electoral map at right now. Wisconsin, Michigan, tilt Republican, Pennsylvania leaning in that direction, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona in the same boat. So, if the polling map is to be right, and of course if the polls are right, Donald Trump would win the 2024 election with 312 electoral votes to Joe Biden's 226, which is a larger margin of victory than he had back in 2016. Now, what's interesting about the polls is that Joe Biden is not just polling weak in purple states, he's also polling very weak in blue states, with the exception of New Hampshire. New Hampshire I have not talked about a lot in these videos because it's really not competitive anymore. New Hampshire has shown that federally and presidentially, it's a state that is pretty likely to go to the Democrats by a high single-digit margin, if not double digits. So this really isn't a state that's in contention. It's interesting that Virginia, which voted to the left of New Hampshire in 2020, is actually more in play, according to the polls, than New Hampshire is. And, part of that could be the fact that you've had a pretty big influx of people from Boston and Massachusetts going into New Hampshire and voting Democratic, which is something a lot of Republicans there lament. But nonetheless, it is interesting. Obviously, polling in both Virginia and New Hampshire is pretty scarce because these states aren't really seen as very competitive. Although we probably will get more polls on these states as we get closer to the election. But as of today, Donald Trump is in a pretty strong position to beat Joe Biden. Again, a lot could change over the next few months. I'm sure things will change as world events, the economy sort of fluctuate. I think the poll numbers are going to follow that. But, as of right now, Joe Biden is in a lot of trouble, and it's not impossible for him to win re-election, but as of right now, it seems very unlikely. And I've been one of those people for months and months and months that has put Donald Trump losing to Joe Biden in every single matchup for a very long time, because when you looked at how the swing states were going, Donald Trump was not polling as high enough in some of these swing states by my estimation to win. And Joe Biden's numbers were not as bad as they are now. I've also realized that, to compare a midterm to a presidential election is not exactly the most accurate way of predicting these things, because obviously midterms have bigger turnout differentials than presidential elections. And, you have a lot more unengaged voters voting in presidential elections as opposed to midterms. So midterms are probably going to be a lot more subject to, dramatic fluctuations based on which political party is more energized to vote. And obviously in 2022, it was the Democrats. This time around in 2024, it looks like it's the Republicans. And independents and even a small segment of Democrats are not very enthusiastic about Joe Biden at all. In fact, Joe Biden's numbers with independents are almost as low as they are with Republicans, which is pretty alarming for Democrats if they actually want to win in November. So they certainly have a lot of work to do in that regard. But anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.